The December air carried a crisp chill through the streets of London as Westminster Abbey stood majestically against the evening sky. Inside the historic walls of this sacred place, preparations were underway for one of the most anticipated events of the festive season. The Princess of Wales, Catherine, moved gracefully through the abbey, her eyes carefully examining every detail of the decorations that would soon welcome hundreds of guests to her special carol service. Catherine had spent months planning this event, pouring her heart into every aspect of the celebration. This wasn't just another royal engagement. This was her personal mission to bring together communities, celebrate those who serve others, and create a moment of unity during the Christmas season. The theme she had chosen for this year's service reflected her deep commitment to early childhood development and the importance of supporting families during their most formative years. As she walked between the rows of wooden pews, Catherine's mind traveled back to the early morning hours when she had first conceived the idea for this particular service. She had been sitting in her private study at Kensington Palace, surrounded by letters from various charities and community organizations. Each letter told a story of dedication, sacrifice, and love. There were tales from nurses who had worked tirelessly through difficult times, teachers who had gone above and beyond for their students, and volunteers who had given their time freely to help those in need. The princess paused at the altar, where magnificent Christmas trees stood adorned with decorations created by children from across the United Kingdom. Each ornament told its own story, crafted with small hands and big hearts. Some were simple paper angels. Others were intricate designs made from recycled materials, but all carried the innocent joy and hope that children bring to the Christmas season. Catherine smiled as she adjusted one particular decoration, a star made by a young girl from Wales who had written about her dream to sing in a choir one day. Behind the scenes, the royal household staff worked with military precision to ensure everything would run smoothly. The Lord Chamberlain's office had coordinated with Westminster Abbey's clergy, the Metropolitan Police, and numerous other organizations to create a seamless experience for all attendees. Security briefings had been conducted, seating arrangements meticulously planned, and every musical note rehearsed to perfection. The musical program for the evening had been personally curated by Catherine, working closely with the Abbey's musical director. She had selected a mixture of traditional carols that would resonate with people of all ages, alongside contemporary pieces that would speak to younger generations. The Westminster Abbey Choir had been practicing for weeks, their voices echoing through the ancient stone chambers during late-night rehearsals. As the day progressed, members of the royal family began to arrive for a brief rehearsal. Prince William entered the Abbey with their 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. The young royals, dressed smartly for the occasion, looked around with wonder at the transformed space. George, now growing into his role as a future king, maintained a composed demeanor, while Charlotte's eyes sparkled with excitement at the twinkling lights. Louis, the youngest, held tightly to his father's hand, occasionally pointing at the decorations with delight. William approached Catherine with a warm smile, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Their partnership in both marriage and royal duties had grown stronger over the years, and he understood how much this event meant to her. They had discussed at length the importance of using their platform to highlight the extraordinary work of ordinary people, especially during challenging times when communities needed hope and encouragement the most. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived to discuss the order of service with the royal couple. His presence added spiritual gravitas to the occasion, and his planned address would weave together themes of service, compassion, and hope. He spoke with Catherine about the importance of recognizing those who embody the Christmas spirit throughout the year, not just during the festive season. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows through the Abbey's stained glass windows, the final preparations were being made. The flowers had arrived, beautiful arrangements of white roses, holly, and winter berries that would line the aisles. Each arrangement had been carefully designed to complement the Abbey's Gothic architecture while adding warmth and festive cheer to the space. Catherine took a moment to review the guest list one final time. Among the invited were healthcare workers who had shown exceptional dedication, teachers who had transformed young lives, charity workers who had supported vulnerable families, and young people who had overcome significant challenges. Each invitation had been personally signed by the princess, with a handwritten note thanking them for their service. The broadcast team from ITV had also arrived, setting up their cameras at strategic points throughout the abbey. The service would be filmed for later broadcast, allowing millions of people across the nation to share in this special moment. Catherine had insisted that the filming be done sensitively, ensuring that the sacred nature of the service remained intact while still capturing the joy and meaning of the occasion. As evening approached, the abbey's bells began to ring, their ancient voices calling across London. The sound carried on the winter wind, reaching the homes and hearts of those preparing to attend. In households across the city, invited guests were putting on their finest clothes, many feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness about attending such a prestigious event. Among those preparing was Sarah Mitchell, a community nurse from Birmingham who had been nominated by her colleagues for her extraordinary work with elderly patients. She stood before her mirror, adjusting the new dress she had bought specially for the occasion. Her husband helped her with her necklace, a simple pearl strand that had belonged to her mother. Sarah had never imagined she would one day be invited to a royal event, and the honor both thrilled and humbled her. In another part of London, Marcus Thompson, a primary school teacher from a challenging inner-city school, straightened his tie for the third time. He had dedicated his career to helping children from disadvantaged backgrounds discover their potential. When the invitation had arrived, he had initially thought it was a joke. Only after calling the palace to confirm did the reality sink in. His students had been beside themselves with excitement when he told them, and many had made him promise to remember every detail to share with them later. The Walkers, a family who had fostered over 30 children throughout their marriage, were traveling together to the abbey. Their current foster children had helped them prepare, choosing their outfits, and practicing their best behavior for meeting royalty. The family represented the thousands of foster carers across the nation who opened their homes and hearts to children in need. Back at the abbey, Catherine made her final rounds, checking with the choir director, confirming details with the security team, and ensuring that the special touches she had planned were in place. Small gift bags had been prepared for each guest, containing a commemorative program, a small ornament for their own Christmas tree, and a personal note of thanks from the princess. The military band that would provide some of the musical accompaniment had arrived and was warming up in a side chapel. Their brass instruments gleamed in the candlelight, and the sound of their practice scales added to the anticipation building within the abbey's walls. These were members of the household division bands, who had served at countless royal occasions but still felt the special nature of this particular event. Catherine's private secretary approached with last-minute updates. A few guests had confirmed accessibility requirements, and adjustments had been swiftly made. The princess was determined that everyone should feel welcomed and comfortable, regardless of any physical limitations. Ramps had been installed where needed, and sign language interpreters were positioned where they could be clearly seen. The palace communications team had prepared briefing notes for the media, highlighting the theme of the service and the types of guests who had been invited. Catherine had been clear that while this was a royal event, the focus should be on the invited heroes rather than on the royal family themselves. This was to be a celebration of service, sacrifice, and community spirit. As the final hour before the service approached, the atmosphere in the abbey shifted from one of preparation to one of anticipation. The candles were lit, casting a warm glow throughout the sacred space. The scent of pine from the Christmas trees mixed with the ancient smell of stone and incense that had permeated the abbey's walls over centuries. Catherine retired briefly to a private room to change into her evening outfit and gather her thoughts. She had chosen an elegant coat dress in deep burgundy, a color that reflected both the formality of the occasion and the warmth of the Christmas season. Her jewelry was understated, but meaningful, pieces that had been gifts from William and that held personal significance. As she prepared, Catherine thought about her own children and the values she hoped to instill in them through events like this. She wanted them to understand that their position came with responsibility, that true nobility lay in service to others, and that the strength of their nation came from the everyday heroes who worked tirelessly in communities across the land. The other members of the royal family began to arrive. The king and queen entered with quiet dignity, understanding the importance of supporting Catherine's initiative. The king, in particular, had expressed his pride in how his daughter-in-law had embraced her role and created meaningful ways to connect the monarchy with the people. Princess Anne arrived with her characteristic punctuality and no-nonsense approach, but even she seemed touched by the transformed abbey and the spirit of the occasion. Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, brought their children, adding to the family atmosphere that Catherine had hoped to create. As the invited guests began to arrive, ushers guided them to their seats with warm smiles and welcoming words. Many of the guests had never been inside Westminster Abbey before, and their faces reflected awe at the grandeur of the space. The Abbey, which had witnessed coronations, royal weddings, and state funerals, tonight served as a gathering place for the nation's unsung heroes. Sarah Mitchell, the community nurse, found herself seated near the front, her hands trembling slightly with nervousness. Next to her sat an emergency response worker who had saved lives during flooding in the north of England. Behind them, a group of young carers who looked after sick family members chatted quietly, their youth contrasting with the heavy responsibilities they carried. The diversity of the congregation reflected modern Britain in all its complexity and beauty. There were people of different faiths who had been invited to share in this Christian celebration of universal values. Catherine had been intentional about ensuring that the service, while rooted in Christian tradition, spoke to themes that transcended religious boundaries: love, service, hope, and community. As the clock neared the hour for the service to begin, a hush fell over the abbey. The choir took their positions, their red and white robes adding to the visual splendor of the scene. The organist prepared at the console of the magnificent instrument that would soon fill the space with music that could lift souls and bring tears to eyes. Catherine took a deep breath and prepared to enter the abbey for the formal beginning of the service. This was more than a royal duty. This was a labor of love, a gift from her heart to the nation. As she stepped forward, ready to welcome her guests and begin this celebration of all that was good in humanity, she felt the weight of tradition balanced perfectly with the freshness of her own vision. The carol service was about to begin, and with it, an evening that would weave together ancient traditions with contemporary relevance, royal grandeur with common humanity, and individual stories into a tapestry of national unity. The stage was set for a truly memorable evening that would touch hearts and inspire continued service long after the last notes of music had faded into the December night. The great doors of Westminster Abbey opened as the royal procession began its stately entrance. Catherine led the way, her presence commanding yet warm, acknowledging the congregation with gentle nods and smiles. Behind her walked Prince William, his hand protectively guiding their youngest son Louis, while George and Charlotte followed with practiced poise. The sight of the young royal family brought spontaneous smiles from the assembled guests, many of whom had their own children and understood the challenge of maintaining dignity with young ones in tow. The Archbishop of Canterbury waited at the altar, his ceremonial robes catching the candlelight as he prepared to welcome the congregation. The first notes of the processional hymn rang out from the organ, and the assembly rose to their feet. The sound of hundreds of voices joining together in once in royal David's city filled the ancient space with a power that seemed to make the very stones sing along. Young Prince Louis, overwhelmed by the grandeur and the sound, pressed closer to his father. William bent down, whispering reassuring words that made the little boy straighten his shoulders and attempt to sing along, though his words were slightly behind everyone else's. Princess Charlotte, ever the perfectionist, held her hymn sheet properly and sang with clear, confident notes that would have made her great-grandmother proud. As the hymn concluded and the congregation took their seats, Catherine stepped forward to deliver her welcome address. She had written and rewritten these words countless times, wanting to strike the perfect balance between formality and warmth. Her voice, clear and steady, carried to every corner of the abbey. "Your Majesty, your Royal Highnesses, distinguished guests, and friends," she began, her eyes sweeping across the congregation. "Welcome to this very special evening. Christmas is a time when we come together to celebrate and to reflect, to look back on the year that has passed and forward to the promise of new beginnings." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the hearts of those listening. "Tonight, we gather not just to sing carols and share in the joy of the season, but to honor something profound, the power of human connection and the extraordinary impact we can have on one another's lives through simple acts of kindness, dedication, and love." The princess continued, speaking of how she had been inspired by the stories of those present, how their examples of service had touched her deeply. She spoke of the teacher who had stayed after school every day to tutor struggling students, never seeking recognition or extra pay. She mentioned the paramedic who had held the hand of an elderly man during his final moments, ensuring he didn't face his journey alone. She honored the teenager who had started a food bank in her local community, rallying her peers to address hunger in their neighborhood. As Catherine spoke, many in the congregation found themselves blinking back tears. They had come expecting a formal royal event, but instead found themselves part of something far more intimate and meaningful. The princess's words weren't just ceremonial platitudes. They carried genuine emotion and understanding. Following Catherine's address, the first reading was delivered by a young carer named Emma, just 16 years old, but carrying responsibilities far beyond her years. Her voice wavered slightly as she began reading from the book of Isaiah, but as she continued, her confidence grew. The passage spoke of bringing good news to the poor and binding up the brokenhearted, words that resonated deeply with her own experience of caring for her disabled mother while trying to maintain her studies. The Westminster Abbey choir then rose to perform the Holly and the Ivy, their voices blending in harmonies that had been perfected over weeks of rehearsal. The acoustic properties of the Abbey transformed their singing into something almost otherworldly, each note seeming to hang in the air before gently dissolving into the next. Prince George, watching the choir with intense concentration, leaned over to whisper something to his grandfather, the king. His Majesty smiled and nodded, perhaps remembering his own childhood experiences of royal ceremonies and the mixture of awe and restlessness they inspired in young minds. The second reading was given by Marcus Thompson, the inner-city teacher. He had chosen a passage from the Gospel of Matthew about letting one's light shine before others. As he read, his mind flickered to his classroom, to the faces of children who had been told they would amount to nothing, but who were now pursuing their dreams because someone had believed in them. His voice grew stronger with each verse, and when he finished, the silence that followed felt sacred. A contemporary carol followed, performed by a community choir from Manchester that included both elderly members who had sung together for decades and young people who had recently discovered the joy of communal singing. Their rendition of Mary, Did You Know? Brought a fresh perspective to the traditional narrative, and their obvious joy in performing together was infectious. During this performance, Catherine noticed one of the invited guests, an elderly veteran named Thomas, wiping away tears. She had read his story, how he had dedicated his retirement to visiting isolated elderly people, understanding from his own experience the pain of loneliness. The music seemed to have touched something deep within him, perhaps memories of Christmases past or the recognition that his years of quiet service were finally being acknowledged. The service continued with a lighting of special candles, each representing a different aspect of community service. A healthcare worker lit the candle for compassion, her hands steady despite the emotion of the moment. A youth worker lit the candle for hope, thinking of all the young people he had helped guide away from destructive paths. A volunteer from a homeless shelter lit the candle for hospitality, remembering cold nights when a warm welcome had literally saved lives. As each candle was lit, the light in the abbey grew warmer, creating an atmosphere that was both solemn and celebratory. Prince Louis, who had been growing slightly restless, became mesmerized by the growing constellation of flames, his small face illuminated by their glow. The archbishop then delivered his sermon, weaving together the themes of the evening with the deeper meaning of Christmas. He spoke of how the birth of Christ in humble circumstances reminded all people that greatness was not found in palaces or positions of power, but in service to others. His words seemed particularly poignant given the setting, speaking to royalty and commoners alike about their shared humanity and shared calling to love their neighbors. In this magnificent abbey, he said, where kings and queens have been crowned, we gather tonight to crown a different kind of nobility, the nobility of service, the royalty of compassion, the majesty of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The congregation then rose for one of the most beloved carols, "O Come, All Ye Faithful." The sound was tremendous, with trained voices mixing with enthusiastic amateurs, creating a joyful noise that seemed to shake the ancient rafters. Even those who rarely sang found themselves drawn into the communal act, their voices joining the river of sound that flowed through the sacred space. During the carol, Catherine glanced at her family. William was helping Louis follow along in the hymn book, though the young prince seemed more interested in waving his candle gently back and forth. Charlotte sang with gusto, occasionally looking up at her mother for approval. George, growing more mature by the day, sang with a seriousness that belied his years, already understanding something of the weight of tradition he carried. After the carol, a special performance was given by a group of children from a hospice that Catherine had visited earlier in the year. These brave young souls, some facing life-limiting conditions, had prepared a simple but moving rendition of "Away in a Manger." Their sweet, clear voices brought a hush to the abbey, and there were few dry eyes as they sang about the little Lord Jesus laying down his sweet head. The children had been practicing for weeks, and their excitement at performing in such a grand setting overcame any nervousness they might have felt. One little girl with bright eyes and an oxygen tube discreetly tucked behind her ears sang with particular enthusiasm, her joy radiating outward and touching everyone who saw her. Following this deeply moving performance, community heroes were invited to share brief testimonies about their work. A foster mother spoke about the moment she decided to open her home to children in need, how that decision had transformed not just the lives of over 30 children, but her own life as well. Her voice cracked as she described the Christmas morning when a child who had never experienced a real Christmas before saw presents under the tree with his name on them. A young man who had established a mental health support network for his peers after losing a friend to suicide spoke next. His words were carefully chosen, but powerful, addressing the epidemic of loneliness and despair that particularly affected young people. He spoke of how small acts of checking in on friends, of listening without judgment, of simply being present could literally save lives. The princess nodded thoughtfully as he spoke, her own work in mental health advocacy clearly resonating with his message. The service included a special prayer segment where representatives from different faith communities offered words of blessing and hope. A rabbi spoke of the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, repairing the world through acts of kindness. An imam offered a prayer for peace and understanding between all people. A Hindu leader shared a Sanskrit blessing for universal well-being. This interfaith element, carefully woven into the Christian service, reflected the reality of modern Britain and Catherine's vision of inclusive community building. During this time, the royal children were given small roles. Princess Charlotte stepped forward to read a prayer she had written herself for all the children in hospitals who couldn't be home for Christmas. Her clear, young voice carried surprising authority as she asked for comfort and healing for sick children everywhere. The pride on her parents' faces was evident, mixed with the poignancy of children praying for other children in difficulty. The musical program continued with a stunning performance of "O Holy Night" by a soloist from the Royal Opera House who had volunteered her time for the event. Her voice soared to the Abbey's heights, the French carol's message of hope and redemption filling the space with almost palpable emotion. During the performance, the camera captured quiet moments of reflection among the congregation. A nurse remembering difficult nights in the hospital, a teacher thinking of students who had overcome tremendous odds, volunteers recalling the faces of those they had helped. As the service moved toward its conclusion, Catherine introduced a new tradition she hoped would continue in future years. She invited everyone present to write a message of hope or gratitude on special cards that had been provided. These messages would be collected and distributed to isolated elderly people, hospital patients, and others who might be spending Christmas alone. The sound of hundreds of pens scratching on paper created its own kind of music, a symphony of compassion being composed in real time. Young Prince Louis, determined to participate, scribbled enthusiastically on his card with a crayon that had been specially provided. His drawing, while abstract, was created with such concentration and love that Catherine carefully folded it and placed it with the others, knowing that somewhere someone would receive this small artwork and perhaps smile at the innocent joy it represented. The king himself participated in this activity, his message carefully crafted to bring comfort to whoever might receive it. Watching the highest in the land, joining with everyone else in this simple act of kindness embodied the entire spirit of the evening. That service knew no boundaries of class or position. As the cards were collected by volunteers who would ensure their distribution, the congregation prepared for more carols. "God rest ye merry gentlemen" rang out with particular vigor, the ancient words about comfort and joy taking on fresh meaning in the context of the evening celebrations. During the carol, palace staff noticed several touching moments throughout the congregation. The emergency worker who had saved lives during floods was seen placing a comforting hand on the shoulder of the elderly veteran next to him, who had become emotional during the singing. Two young carers who had never met before had struck up a friendship, finding common ground in their shared experiences. The foster family was surrounded by other guests expressing admiration and asking how they could become involved in fostering themselves. These spontaneous connections were exactly what Catherine had hoped would emerge from the evening. Beyond the formal ceremony, real relationships were being forged, networks of support were being created, and people who might have felt isolated in their service were discovering a community of fellow servants. The penultimate reading was delivered by Prince William, who had chosen the passage from Corinthians about love, how it is patient and kind, how it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. His delivery was measured and sincere, and those who knew the royal couple well could see how the words reflected his own partnership with Catherine and their shared vision for their roles. As William returned to his seat, he caught Catherine's eye, and they shared a moment of silent communication that spoke of shared purpose and mutual support. Their children, watching their parents, were learning lessons about partnership and service that no amount of formal instruction could provide. The evening's program included a special musical tribute to those who had lost their lives while serving others. A young pianist, himself a survivor of accident where paramedics had saved his life, played a haunting arrangement of Silent Night that he had composed especially for the occasion. The familiar melody, transformed through his artistic interpretation, seemed to carry all the gratitude, loss, and hope that filled the abbey. As the final notes died away, a moment of silence was observed. In that quiet space, filled with hundreds of people, but feeling intimate as a prayer closet, each person carried their own thoughts. Some remembered colleagues who had given their lives in service. Others thought of family members whose dedication had inspired them, and many simply reflected on the privilege of being present at such a moment. The silence was broken by the youngest member of the choir beginning, "Hark! The herald angels sing." Her pure soprano voice soon joined by the full chorus and congregation. The carol's triumphant melody seemed to lift spirits and prepare everyone for the conclusion of this remarkable evening. As the service drew toward its end, Catherine knew that something special had been achieved. Looking out at the congregation, she saw not just an assembly of individuals, but a tapestry of service, each thread essential to the whole. The invited heroes had become visible symbols of the thousands more across the nation who served without recognition, and their presence had transformed a royal ceremony into a national celebration of all that was best in the human spirit. In the days following the carol service, the impact of that magical evening began to ripple outward in ways that even Catherine, with all her careful planning and hopeful vision, could not have fully anticipated. The morning after, newspapers across the nation carried front-page stories not just about the royal event, but about the heroes who had been honored. For once, the headlines focused less on what the princess wore and more on the extraordinary, ordinary people who had been celebrated. Social media exploded with stories from attendees, each sharing their experiences and the connections they had made. The hashtag Together at Christmas began trending, not through any organized campaign, but through organic sharing of stories, photographs, and pledges to serve. Sarah Mitchell, the community nurse, woke to find her simple Twitter account had gained thousands of followers overnight, all eager to hear more about her work and how they could support similar efforts in their own communities. The palace mailroom, accustomed to a steady flow of correspondence, was overwhelmed by the deluge of letters that began arriving. These weren't the usual formal communications or requests for royal patronage, but heartfelt personal messages from people across the nation who had been inspired by the service. Teachers wrote about recommitting to their students, healthcare workers shared stories of renewed purpose, and ordinary citizens described small acts of kindness they had been motivated to perform. One letter particularly touched Catherine when it reached her desk. It was from an elderly woman in Scotland who had watched the service on television. She wrote about how she had been feeling forgotten and useless in her old age, but seeing the elderly veteran Thomas being honored for his volunteer work had inspired her to contact her local community center about opportunities to help others. She had discovered a program reading to children at the local library and had signed up immediately. "You've helped me remember," she wrote, "that we're never too old to make a difference." The children who had carried lanterns became overnight symbols of hope. Schools across the country requested information about how to create similar ceremonies, understanding the power of giving young people meaningful roles in community celebrations. Amara, the young Syrian refugee who had spoken so eloquently, received invitations to share her story at other events. Her journey from frightened refugee to confident young leader, inspiring both immigrants and native-born Britons alike. Back at Kensington Palace, Catherine convened meetings with her team to discuss how to maintain the momentum created by the service. She was adamant that this should not be a one-time event that generated temporary warm feelings before everyone returned to their normal routines. Working with various charities and organizations, plans began to form for a national network connecting those who served with those who needed help and those who wanted to begin serving. The technology team at the Royal Foundation worked overtime to create an online platform where the connections made at the service could be maintained and expanded. Within weeks, a website was launched that allowed volunteers to find opportunities in their local areas, organizations to share resources and best practices, and communities to celebrate their local heroes. The platform was deliberately designed to be decentralized, empowering local communities rather than creating another top-down bureaucracy. Prince William threw his full support behind the initiative, using his platform to highlight different forms of service across the nation. He began a series of surprise visits to community organizations, always bringing attention not to his presence, but to the work being done. His genuine interest and ability to connect with people from all backgrounds meant these visits generated not just publicity, but real support for the causes he highlighted. The impact on the royal children was profound and lasting. Prince George, inspired by the young carers he had met, requested to volunteer at a local charity during his school holidays. With appropriate security measures in place, he spent time helping to sort donations at a food bank, working alongside other children his age and learning firsthand about the challenges faced by families in need. The experience of being just another volunteer, valued for his contribution rather than his title, provided invaluable life lessons. Princess Charlotte, with her characteristic determination, started a project at her school to support the children's hospice that had performed at the service. She organized her classmates to create cards, pictures, and small gifts for the young patients, and even performed a small concert with her school choir at the hospice. The sight of the young princess sitting beside sick children, reading stories, and sharing giggles showed that the values celebrated at the carol service were being lived out in the next generation. Even young Prince Louis, in his own way, absorbed the lessons of that evening. His parents noticed him being more eager to help at home, proudly announcing he was being a helper like the people at the church. His innocent enthusiasm for putting his toys away or helping to set the table might have seemed trivial, but it represented the beginning of understanding that service could be part of daily life. The foster family, the Walkers, found their lives transformed by the connections made at the service. Within months, they had helped establish a support network for foster families in their region, providing mentorship for new foster parents and advocacy for better resources. Their story, shared at the service, had inspired dozens of families to consider fostering, helping to address the critical shortage of foster homes across the nation. Marcus Thompson, the inner-city teacher, leveraged his new connections to transform his struggling school. Partnerships with businesses and charities brought new resources, volunteer mentors, and enrichment programs that had previously been unimaginable. Test scores improved, but more importantly, students began to believe in their own potential. Several older students, inspired by their teachers' recognition at the Royal Service, started their own peer tutoring program, embodying the principle that everyone had something valuable to offer. The healthcare workers who had attended found themselves at the center of a renewed national conversation about valuing and supporting those in caring professions. Sarah Mitchell became an unofficial spokesperson for community nurses, her practical wisdom and compassionate approach resonating with both fellow professionals and the public. She used her platform to advocate for better working conditions and resources, but always brought the focus back to the patients and families served. 3 months after the service, Catherine received an unexpected visit from one of the young carers who had attended. The teenager, named Oliver, had started a national organization for young carers, inspired by the connections he had made that evening. With support from established charities and the momentum from the carol service, his organization was already providing support groups, respite programs, and advocacy for the thousands of young people across Britain who cared for family members. The interfaith element of the service had also borne fruit. Religious leaders who had participated began meeting regularly, planning joint initiatives to serve their communities together. Mosques, churches, synagogues, temples, and Gurdwaras found common ground in service projects, their congregations working side by side to address local needs. The sight of people from different faiths serving together became increasingly common, breaking down barriers and building understanding. 6 months after the carol service, Catherine decided to visit some of the communities where new initiatives had sprouted. Traveling often without fanfare or media attention, she witnessed firsthand the multiplication effect of that December evening. In Manchester, she found a thriving network of volunteers supporting elderly residents, inspired by Thomas, the veteran's example. In Cardiff, she visited a new program connecting young people aging out of foster care with mentors and support created by people who had met at the service. One particularly moving visit was to a small town in Yorkshire where the entire community had embraced the spirit of the carol service. The local church, inspired by Westminster Abbey's example, had held their own service honoring local heroes. But more than that, the town had created a culture where service was celebrated year-round. Shop windows displayed photos of local volunteers. The town newsletter featured a hero of the month, and children grew up seeing service to others as a normal, admirable part of life. The media coverage of these initiatives created a positive cycle. Stories of communities coming together, of lives being transformed through service, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, began to balance the often negative news cycle. Journalists found that readers were hungry for these stories of hope and human connection, leading to regular features on local heroes and community initiatives. A year after the carol service, when December came around again, anticipation built for what had now become an established tradition. But Catherine was determined that the second service should not simply repeat the first. Working with communities across the nation, she developed a theme of growing together, celebrating not just individual acts of service, but the networks and relationships that had developed. The guest list for the second service included many from the first, but now they came representing expanded programs and new partnerships. Sarah Mitchell arrived not just as a community nurse, but as the leader of a national initiative supporting healthcare workers. The Walkers came with 3 other foster families they had mentored. Marcus Thompson brought 2 of his former students who had gone on to become teachers themselves, continuing the cycle of service. New faces joined them, people whose lives had been touched by the initiatives spawned from the first service. The elderly woman from Scotland who had written to Catherine was there, now a beloved fixture at her local library's children's reading program. Young people who had been inspired to volunteer, business leaders who had restructured their companies to support employee volunteering, and religious leaders whose congregations had built bridges across faith divides, all gathered in the Abbey once more. This time, when the children processed with their lanterns, they represented not just those who had been helped, but those who had become helpers. Former recipients of charity who had found ways to give back, young carers who had found support and were now supporting others, and refugees who had integrated into British society and were contributing their unique gifts to their communities all walked together, their lights symbolizing an ever-expanding network of service. Prince George, now a year older and more confident, gave a reading at this second service. His clear, young voice reading words about loving one's neighbor carried special poignancy, representing the passing of values from one generation to the next. Charlotte and Louis sat proudly watching their brother, understanding in their own ways that they were part of something larger than themselves. The testimonies of the second service focused not on individual stories, but on collective impact. Communities shared how they had been transformed, organizations described new collaborations, and individuals spoke of finding purpose and connection through service. The message was clear. What had begun as a single evening of celebration had become a movement of mutual support and community building. The Archbishop, in his sermon at the second service, reflected on the parable of the mustard seed, how the smallest of seeds had grown into something that provided shelter for many. He drew parallels to how the simple act of bringing people together to celebrate service had grown into a national renewal of community spirit. His words carried weight because everyone present had witnessed this growth firsthand. As years passed, the carol service became a cherished national tradition. But more importantly, the spirit it embodied became woven into the fabric of British society. Universities began including community service as part of their curricula, inspired by the young people recognized at the services. Businesses created volunteer programs for employees, understanding that service to community was good for both society and corporate culture. Schools made celebrating local heroes a regular part of their calendar, helping children understand that heroism came in many forms. The royal family's commitment to the initiative remained strong. As George, Charlotte, and Louis grew, they took increasingly active roles not just in the service, but in volunteer work throughout the year. Seeing young royals working alongside ordinary citizens in food banks, environmental projects, and literacy programs sent a powerful message about the democratization of service. Catherine, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a simple desire to celebrate those who served others, often marveled at how far beyond her original vision the impact had spread. The carol service had become not just an annual event, but a catalyst for lasting change in how British society recognized and supported those who gave of themselves for others. In communities across the nation, the ripple effects continued to spread. Support groups for carers flourished, volunteer networks strengthened, and the connection between service and fulfillment became more widely understood. Young people grew up seeing service not as an obligation, but as an opportunity, not as extraordinary, but as beautifully ordinary, something anyone could do, regardless of their background or circumstances. The Westminster Abbey carol service had achieved something remarkable. It had taken the ancient tradition of celebrating Christmas through song and worship and had renewed it for a modern age. It had shown that tradition and innovation could work together, that royal ceremony could serve democratic values, and that bringing people together in celebration of service could create lasting change. As each December approached, anticipation built not just for a beautiful ceremony, but for the renewal of commitment to community that the service represented. The sight of lantern-bearing children processing through the ancient abbey had become a symbol of hope carried forward, of light spreading from person to person, community to community, until the entire nation glowed a little brighter with the warmth of human kindness. The true legacy of that first carol service was not measured in the number of attendees or media coverage, but in the countless acts of service performed by people who had been inspired to make a difference. It lived in the elderly person who no longer felt alone because a volunteer visited weekly, in the child who succeeded in school because a mentor believed in them, in the family that stayed together because they received support during a crisis. Catherine's vision of a service that would honor those who serve had succeeded beyond her dreams. But, in a way, it had only revealed what had always been true, that Britain, like any nation, was at its best when its people cared for one another. The carol service had simply shone a light on this truth, celebrated it, and encouraged it to grow. As the years continued, each service built upon the last, new traditions were added, and new communities were reached. But, at its heart, the message remained constant and simple, that in serving others, people found purpose, connection, and joy, that everyone had something valuable to offer, that heroes walked among us every day, wearing not capes or crowns, but the simple dignity of those who chose to help their neighbors. The Westminster Abbey carol service had become more than an event. It had become a movement, a tradition, and a yearly reminder of the power of human kindness. And in the glow of candlelight, in the sound of voices raised in song, in the sight of people from all walks of life joined together in celebration of service, the true spirit of Christmas lived on, renewed and strengthened with each passing year.